Yeah, start Mahesh.
Oh, just Namaskar. Welcome to this series which we have been conducting for last almost 1 month now from Sri Ram Jayanti and talking on various aspects. And this month of January for whole Kashmiri Pandit community has been a month of gloom, darkness, and you can say persecution because on 19 January 1990, the persecution of Kashmiri Pandits reached a stage from where there was all turmoil, which we are still witnessing in terms of religious cleansing, Holocaust, and everything. Today, we have a very illustrious personality with us who has been contributing in sensitizing not only the community but the whole mechanism of this devastating, deceptive, subversive kind of violation of human rights which has taken place with Hindus of Kashmir in 1990, and then explaining it to the wider Dharmis all across the globe. What is the basic intent of this whole process? I welcome Dr. Girdari lal Bhan Sahab in this program, and it's a privilege to have him here. Before going ahead, I would like to just give a brief view of his whole work and personality. Dr. Saab is basically a doctor by profession, and he was born in Srinagar. And then in his illustrious service, he has been a wonderful physician also. And then his scientific temper and spirituality reflects throughout his whole bio or resume, whatever you call. He has been a Swayamsevak of Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh in UK and served in Vishwa Hindu Parishad UK in sensitizing the people, the diaspora about the Dharma. And then going along, if I go down, I can see he has been ex-chair of Vedic Organization for Indian Culture and Education in Manchester. And then his interests are so integral to our consciousness, like the Shastra interpretation, Hindu human rights in Kashmir. And then he has not just stuck here, he has tried to go for interfaith sensitization in UK. That is a wonderful thing, a lobbying that he has done. And then in media, in the early 90s, he has been very forthright in basically presenting to the world at large what is happening in Jammu and Kashmir, what is happening in terms of jihad during his hard talk on BBC, and then Kashmir issue related things on BBC Radio and Radio Manchester. And then going beyond, even in 2019, he has also had a wonderful, been a wonderful panelist in one of the talks on the Hindu view. And then he has been on advisory bodies, panel experts on religious affairs, even in BBC. And then academically, besides contributing his professional papers in medicine, his his basically contribution in seminars like papers on Dharma and society, concept of Hinduism, and then Ayurveda, and then ancient science of the India, then spirituality, and most importantly, his work to sensitize the masses about terrorism, its threat to multiculturalism, and terrorism in India. Then how the Dharmis were being subjected to kind of you can say persecution, and then this Islamophobic response and the things like that. And ultimately, his publications from 2002 to 2019 and even today, I can see a chronology, a continuity, we can say a tireless crusade he is running to sensitize the people at even at this stage of life. That is really motivating for us. And we were very keen to know him because we have heard about him here, his work, his silent work, his constructive work, his very rational work. And today we can see he has also one more thing. He has written a book, co-authored a book on 16 samskaras of the life of Hindus, and then explaining Hindu Dharma. I think there is not a better person to tell us about this whole thing. Like the best thing to ask him is that how he felt the need to actually sensitize the Dharmis, I must say, the Hindus across the globe, and he was located offshores. And what kind of motivation he had to sensitize the masses, and what was the response of the people, how his concern was taken, had it effect on the lobbyists, or the, you can say, pressure groups or think tanks, what actually made him to go on this path of sensitization in these challenging times, Dr. Saab?
Namaskar, Katumara Namaskar. I do not know what to say. You've taken my breath away because you have described me as somebody who is special, which I am not. In my talks, in my presentations, and in any articles I may have written, I have expressed my thoughts of an ordinary individual, not a scholar, not an academic. And I'm not an expert on anything at all. But I have journeyed from being in Kashmir. I graduated there. And up till then, when I look back, I had a Kashmir Valley view of the world. I then spent a few years in Jammu and traveled around, and I got the India view of the world. When I came to England in my few earlier years, I was able to broaden my vision, and I got a degree of how we are, whether we as Kashmiris or as Indians, within that world, a little bigger cosmos. And then when the Holocaust arrived, I perforce had to go to other places, particularly in Europe, interacted with people, heard their viewpoints. And that educated me, and I got what I would now call a broader, a more worldly worldview of who we are and how do we fit in within that world order. That to me was a learning point. And therefore, I have worked both as a Kashmiri and as a Hindu, because I came to know, I was always conscious of my Hindu faith and culture, but I came to know that we are Hindus for first and foremost. And when you look back into your remote history and you know of your luminaries in the past, and you know that they were in the forefront of our ancient Hindu civilization, of which we must always be aware. So I will, when we talk, because this is a conversation, when we talk, perhaps you can probe me on anything that you feel at any time so that I can say things. May I say in the beginning, I will ramble on, and there are issues where I might be politically incorrect, and I'm not concerned about that. I'm a retired individual now, and I don't need to be politically incorrect, whether it is to do with governments, whether it is with people of faith or whatever. So it's a very candid expression of my thinking, but I'm all in your hands. Okay, perhaps you lead on and guide me.
So, Dr. Saab, we'd like to understand from you, when 90s, this all turmoil started, this genocide started. What was the situation on ground in Kashmir, and what was the public perspective all over the globe? Rest in India first, when you later you went away to UK. What was the situation about this genocide? How people took it? Were people really ready to reconcile what was happening in Kashmir to the Hindus of Kashmir? Did they respond to the way they should have?
I will come to that. I'll come to that in due course. Let me talk about my very early childhood. And I have very faint memories of my elders talking about, reminiscing about the Kabaili raid. And they talking about how they had put their clothes in bundles because they didn't know at what time they may have to run for their lives. That was one point that I kept remembering. Teman dahunu iswaran ko si poet kya iswaran sunpalau
Tulpalav Vatsalai.
Vatsalau bana haile butchalau. And it used to be a joke, but it was deep in our psyche. And I think it has to do with the fact that this wasn't the first time it happened to us. It was deep in our subconscious that such thing could happen anytime. And I will make a point about that in towards the end, that helped us to a large extent in our survival. As a community, a lot worse could have happened the way it had been planned. The lot worse would have happened, and what happened was awful, but a lot worse could have happened if we hadn't got that acute survival instinct and left. I remember we had once a Hindu meeting. This was maybe within a few years of that. A very well-meaning, very scholarly Hindu from South India came and to give a talk, a pravachan. And I was his host at that time. And in his talk, he said, the Kashmiri Hindus were cowards, that they left their homes and at births and so on. One of the people, my local colleagues, he looked with consternation at me at that time. I kept quiet. I was the host. Afterwards, he said to me, Dr. Saab, why didn't you say anything? And I said to him, that would have been against the principles of hospitality. After all, he was a valued guest, and I didn't want to, because his pravachan dealt with some other topic, and it would have hijacked the discussion, and I would have to take time with him. I would educate him, but it wasn't his fault because he had said what he said based on hearsay. And that underlies this point about how did people take it. The problem was they didn't know. Vast majority of the people remained ignorant for a very long time. And we can go into that. And I think we all know now why it was happening. But what happened to me in the first instance when I came here, I was still with that Kashmir view of the world and the problems and the concerns we had within our society. My first education was that within the broader Hindu Samaj, we share those problems and those concerns. And as we started uh, dealing with those, interacting with members of our own community, broader Hindu Samaj, with many sampradayas, with many languages and um, so-called subcultures, I found the same laid-back attitude, the same selective amnesia of things, the same ignorance, the same devil may take the other person, I couldn't care less, blah, blah, blah. Until it happens to you. And at that time we scream, where are they? I remember the time when I first visited at camp in Batalbalia, and they all came forward. My nephew was with me, and he was taking a video, lost those videos. And one person, young man, came very angry. Are you a journalist? Are you taking pictures here? Who has sent you? Where is the government of India? Where is Bharat Mata? We came, left Kashmir and expecting that they will protect us. Where are they? And I was taken aback. I had lost for words. I didn't know what to say to him. So we all lived within our own intellectual cocoons. And there is a Jewish saying, a poem, which titles, and they came for me. So one by one, I came for somebody and somebody was taken away, I didn't bother. Then they came for the other person and I didn't bother. Then they came for my neighbor and I didn't bother. Then they came for me and I said, where is everybody? Do you understand that? So that transformation of my thought process was fundamental. And I realized that I'm nobody without the broader Hindu Samaj.
That
And
is
therefore, I um, went neck deep into the Hindu Samaj here. And from there, I learned quite a lot. So, what did I learn here? Let me start with that. Within the non Hindu world, there's been and still is a focus on an anti Hindu narrative about Hindus, which presents a false, distorted scenario, harping continuously on things like caste, caste based discrimination, and untouchability, every so often reporting on cases of torture, murder, rape, and gang rape of girls and women, described as Dalit. All the victims described as Dalit, by men described as those belonging to upper caste Hindu society. Note these words in repeated descriptions here. This is how it is mentioned. If there is no Dalit angle, real or assumed, such an incident does not get reported. So I started saying to myself, this is not the same as I knew. I know there are rapes there, I know there are awful things happening, but all the time, only the upper caste Hindu people doing this thing to Dalits, um, and that's how it was reported. Reference to Hindus worship 330 million gods, and this is typical of monotheists who have the God-given monopoly on religion and truth that there's only one God. So they would want to, put rub our nose in the door by saying this, that they worship stones, monkeys, and elephants, that they treat widows inhumanly, abandoning them in the widow ashrams. And there have been many television documentaries on that Hindu women are abused physically and psychologically, highlighting the ills of arranged marriages within Hindu society, repeatedly referring to the practice of sati and to dowry deaths, and so on. All these things are continuously harped. What happens? All these and many more are directly ascribed to Hindu faith. The media and academic discussions are dominated by anti-Hindu and ultra-left forces. No wonder the average non-Hindu has a very distorted picture of Hindus and their faith and culture. Narratives like these are heavily exaggerated, not infrequently fed to the general public by these people with vested interests. We Hindus, I came to realize that we Hindus need to reach out and explain that this is not a correct picture, that our faith-based culture is beyond all such practices, that such practices are not prescribed by Hindu Shastras, especially the Shrutis, that any such acts are social malpractice that have arisen within Indian, not Hindu society, within Indian society, not Hindu society. This is important because all these things are to be found in Indian people of other faiths as well, but that's not highlighted. I remember watching one BBC documentary a long time back by a lady called Arundhati Roy. And at that time, she wasn't as left-wing as she is now. And she made a documentary on caste-based, so-called caste-based discrimination and untouchability within the Christians of South India. That was just shown once and never repeated again. But at that time, she had an open mind. And it just shows that such things exist within the Indian society, and it has nothing to do with the Hindu faith. But if you are a non-Hindu here and all the time reading magazines and newspapers and reading these reports and watching documentaries, you cannot be blamed for having a very anti-Hindu bias. That was one of the things that struck me over the first few years. So, therefore, one job that we had to do, and within the Sangh, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and other Hindu organizations, we set about responding to that false narrative. Look at the caste malpractice. The relevant social evil of caste discrimination is entirely distinct from the social stratification by Varna, which comes down from Rigved, in which there is no right to inheritance by birth. That means I, born in a Brahmin family, do not automatically qualify to be a Brahmin. And in which social mobility has been allowed from the very ancient times of the lower caste, so-called lower Varna people becoming rishis and maharishis, and people who were high quality Brahmins because of the misdeeds that they did, be virtually being made outcasts. And these are accounts I have read within the Puranas and the epics. So there was no question of a birthright, and there was no question of non-social mobility. Social mobility was there. What happened was the distortion of within the society of practices. Those who were in power, in authority, made sure that the social mobility would not happen. And what we saw in the last century or so, and we came to know that it had reached a stage which was abhorrent. I don't want to complicate the issue by saying that we had 1,000 years of slavery and we learned to stay indoors most of the time, and therefore our practices became even more complicated. But that's another issue. It was the Portuguese who first used the word caste in the description of India's social stratification, to be quickly taken up by the British rulers who misused it for political reasons. Very quickly, they introduced it into the Indian census, giving it a legal basis, and then used it to promote the policy of divide and rule, as they did indeed in several other fields. The leftist academics and commentators omit to mention the progress made by the Hindu society in the elimination of such discrimination and the role played by Hindu leaders and social reformers. They have a selective amnesia, as they have in many other instances where you could have said, well, what about this and that? They don't want to know that. They only want to know things on which they can criticize us and our practices rightly or inappropriately. You mentioned about the Indian diaspora. How did they respond to the genocide of the Hindus of Kashmir? In brief, it was one of shock and then sympathy. But there was no ensuing public outcry, which there should have been. That was surprising in the beginning. Then I learned it was because most people didn't know what had happened. The media wouldn't convey the true picture, portray the real victims, and publish any accounts of the exodus and genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. And I couldn't understand that. It hadn't happened. It was a figment of our imagination that Hindus had migrated out of the valley of their own accord for economic reasons or as instructed by the then Governor Jagmohan. That's what I kept reading. I am sorry to say that in the very early years, what few news channels we had here, run by people of Indian origin, they also failed us. On the other hand, the news channels of Pakistani descent on cue from their higher masters from the very start had gone into an overdrive promoting the Pakistani narrative. I remember one instance while I was in Delhi, this was in the mid 90s, reading in the India Today an interview with, I shouldn't name him, but he's deceased, and I think it's George Fernandez. And it was over 2 or 3 pages, and one line struck me like a thunderbolt. When he was asked why did this happen, he said, well, this was a reaction by the local majority because Pandits had 99% of the jobs and they were 1% of the population. Muslims had 99% of the population and 1% of the job. How could you justify that? And I was amazed. I said to myself, how could he, propagate such blatant lies, such exaggeration? But that was supposed to be politically correct those days, to go along with false narratives. He was trying to see how magnanimous he was in speaking the truth as people wanted to hear. Hence, the majority of the people of Indian origin here remained ignorant for far too long. They were not getting any true accounts from their relatives and friends in India also over the phone, because these people in different parts of the country were also in the dark, because the local papers, the broadsheets, and the main channels would not convey the correct picture. The governments of the day in India, in their wisdom, and their embassies and high commissions overseas under instruction, had decided to keep a low profile on this issue. The embassies and the high commissions did not make any contribution to discussions and debates in the media as they took place here. They were conspicuously absent, and I say that very clearly. We were left with that job. Very gradually, I would say well beyond the 90s, more members of the Indian diaspora came to know of the reality. I would like to say we did contribute in that sphere in whichever way we could to raising the awareness of our diaspora and indeed the local public about what actually was happening. But we were unable to reach the mainstream media in a substantive way. Their doors were shut to us. May I here just make a contribution to what happened? We have had an association here called Kashmiri Pandit Association of Europe, and one of our stalwart leaders, Dr. Ganju, who's sadly passed away recently, but we also had what's known as Indian Indo-European Kashmir Forum, in which we had very, very astute leadership from Dr. Shibandurani, and then after that, we now have Krishna Jiban, and they have done tremendous work on these lines, holding conferences even within Parliament on a regular basis, more recently to commemorate our Balidan Divas, as you referred to. I think do you want me to talk about the denial of genocide? Comments on that? Would you
Yes,
like to?
exactly. I would now, it's very clear. You gave the whole picture. What was the situation, how it has penetrated, how Indian political class reacted. You gave the example of
Yeah.
late George Fernandez.
But
You also not,
you may expand on that a bit later on. I
yes,
could give further
yes,
comments.
yes, yes.
This
Basically,
time, this is just to
now I,
first.
I, I just want to come to the denial actually.
Yes.
So this is basically this background makes us to come to the denial of Kashmiri Pandit genocide. So, in your view, how do you see this denial has compounded over the years in terms of media denial, in terms of you can say using the terms which lead to the appropriation of the Kashmiri Pandit genocide? For example, terrorists were called militants. Internally displaced Kashmiri Pandits were called migrants in the state lexicon. So this is a kind of denial. So how do you see what exactly has shaped this state psyche to create this Kashmiri Pandit denial? By this, who is going to benefit? Doesn't the state apparatus or policymakers understand that the denial of genocide leads to the duplication of genocide and it's spreading to the mainland India now? What is your opinion on that?
On reflection, I would have said things differently previously, but on reflection now, I give credit to the Pakistani political terrorist class and their media and their propaganda machinery. I do give them credit. We were completely exposed as inept, including our politicians and the media. Let me briefly narrate the Pakistani narrative, which is fairly well known to everybody, but it's important to reiterate the basics of it. That Kashmir is a disputed territory illegally occupied by India, which does not allow a UN recommended plebiscite. It has a massive army of occupation in the valley, and its soldiers are routinely committing atrocities on the civilians there. This was hammered in and day out, and there was absolutely no mention of somebody called a Hindu. It is a Muslim state. No mention of anything called Hindu. And all the time, repeated reports coming through of persecution of the Muslims of the state. Um, some in the media here knowingly and actively, and I use those words after due care, promoted this false narrative for reasons best known to them. And I won't say that, I think we can all form our own opinions on that point. I would say others were naive, doing their desk jobs, handling materials they had received, then printing or broadcasting the same with their editor's approval. The media are supposed to be accountable to the public, having to be sensitive to the feedback which is by law to be monitored. That's here. In this case, they were barraged by a massive feedback from British Muslims through telephone calls, letters, emails, meetings, and demonstrations outside the media headquarters, busloads of people arriving at the media headquarters for demonstrations, loud sloganeering, heckling their delegates at meeting, very assertive and at times aggressive. And the media people didn't know how to respond to that. They are not used, they hadn't been used to that. The picture on our side was one of ignorance and apathy. The few who knew what was going on wanted to adopt a gentle approach. And the overall result was that we were easily ignored. Why was there this denial of the genocide? I would make four comments. The first one is the Indian government during the early years tried its best to suppress the actual story about the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus in the misguided belief that publicizing what was happening might annoy the Kashmiri Muslims. Their continued attempts to try please the militant jihadis among Kashmiri Muslims has now been put in the public domain by Sri Sushil Pandit, among others. To put this into context, I must add such revelations are only possible now since the transfer of power from the Congress to the BJP and the sections of media now willing to do so. It wouldn't have been possible. We wouldn't have had a voice 20 years ago. The international media were not allowed into, that's the second point, the international media were not allowed into the valley by the government. The journalists who tried and failed formed the opinion that the government of India had something to hide, that maybe this narrative coming from Pakistan was correct. Some of them managed to reach Kashmir Valley after having been smuggled by the terrorists from across the Pakistan occupied Kashmir to be fed this false Pakistani narrative by the pro-terrorist parties who came to meet them in the valley and showed them certain individuals alleged to be victims of this persecution. And I've read a book by an English lady who started her journey in Pakistan occupied Kashmir and then went. I've also read account of a British parliamentarian of that time who was taken on a first class basis and given total assistance and transport and taken and taken to the camps in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, where people had been put in line with disabilities, and these were shown him to be the victims of the atrocities committed by the soldiers, Indian soldiers. He then writes that that was fine, I accepted that. But when I was taken on several days to various other camps, I recognized that I had seen many of them in the previous camps and realized that something was not right here. That, I mean, people, it's dawned to people not because of what we did, but because it just happened, truth was coming out and it was filtering through. So did the Delhi-based journalists with their vested interests at that time. They were also peddling and feeding the same similar narrative, some of them. All the reports that came here were de facto based on these pro-terrorists, referring to, and these were at this time, I remember this kept happening for 10 to 15 years, the terrorists were referred as separatists, later on as insurgents, never as terrorists. Now, anybody with right mind would know what is happening in Kashmir, if not on the first day, after a few years. But they kept on doing that. When we challenged some of these journalists and the broadcast channels, and we did, and asked how had they obtained their accounts without having visited the valley, they stated that their reports were based on accounts received from India, from Delhi. The third factor is the geopolitical factor. From before the time of partition, the British establishment had planned for Kashmir to be with Pakistan. And you have to read books which have drawn material from the released archives in the British government. And there is now no question that had been the case. And Mountbatten had worked indirectly towards this goal as the first Governor General of India, with only a partial success. So instead of Kashmir going to Pakistan, it only happened with what's now known as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So he didn't succeed fully. With terrorism rampant in the valley, the Pakistani diaspora here kept reminding the politicians, and note this, the Pakistani diaspora here kept reminding the politicians and the public that Kashmir was an international issue. It was the unfinished business of the partition. When I read that, I said to me, what is this unfinished business of Pakistan partition? And that it was Britain's duty to finish this business. So that's the third point that is relevant to this. And why do I pick up on Britain? Because Britain was the ruler of India, colonial India, because Britain was party to this partition and responsible for this partition. And they had promised Muslims they would get Kashmir. The fourth point is that there has been and remains a historical affiliation of the British to others of the Abrahamic origin. So they feel that there's a lot of similarities between these peoples. The Pakistani sources kept reminding them that in private and in public, and that's where I heard this thing, garnering support for themselves, we are cousins, and subtly engendering an antipathy towards those who are non-Abrahamic, in this case, Indian non-Muslims. And that's a point you should take note of. These are factors that worked behind why there was no response, why Britain and the West did not seem to be bothered with what was happening. Remember the Yazidi Holocaust. Remember the Bosnian issue. At that time, the entire West was up in arms. Why were they silent when it was Kashmir? And these factors I would like you to take into account. Okay.
Now, Dr. Saab, you beautifully explained this whole state of desperation and now the wilderness in camps, which we never expected. We're thrown like fish out of the pond, and now people were thinking of shelter, of sustenance, of survival on a very different, you can say, environment. Coming out, as you rightly said earlier, that we were never out of the cocoon, and ultimately this was like a thunderbolt. It hit us. So
Mm.
what was your response and the response of your like-minded people on the ground in terms of humanitarian needs of the people in camps? You can say kind of a succor to the people. How you were on, what was the kind of charity that was going for these destabilized people, religiously cleansed people? What kind of work was present on the ground? What you actually felt, and how you were responding at the ground zero?
Um, I have little to say on this issue, because in the broader scenario, a lot more work has been done by others. What we did, however, and this was on behalf of the Kashmiri Hindu community here, and I must acknowledge, with help from many other Hindus with whom we were in contact, that activity came about principally after our visit to the campsites, the temporary settlements. In Jammu city, as you know, there were many, um, Patoli, Palora, etc., etc. In Udhampur, in Batalbalia, in Nagrota, Kathua, and later on in Delhi. We assessed their immediate needs, and this is at the moment that they were coming out. And we supplied some of those needs that we thought were urgent, like bed frames, beddings, textbooks, and writing material like stationery for children, etc., etc. Things that could not wait. I remember within a tent, they had put up a sort of a blackboard, and with a chalk, one of the persons who had either teaching experience or had volunteered, and the children, little children, were sitting on the ground uh, facing him, and he was giving them lessons. I remember that. And they said, we don't have anything to write on. They don't have any books to read. And so, therefore, those were the things we responded with. I was conscious at that time that other agencies were also actively helping these destitute people. And we did our best to avoid duplication of aid and ensure that as many as possible received that basic aid. I think that's one thing that we did. Uh, at the next stage, we handed out small amounts of financial aid to young boys and girls to help them with their schooling. And we would make sure that the money went into their bank accounts in their names to make sure there was no seepage. And this is without any, um, you know, complaint or any judgment. It's human nature that sometimes all the money doesn't reach the recipient. We did that. That was something we did meticulously. I need to state that whatever I did, I was doing on behalf of and with help from our local body, Kashmiri Pandit Association of Europe, and with the help of many British Hindu donors. I must never forget that. And I'm grateful to all of them. All the donations were documented and records of transactions have been kept and maintained. But we reached a point of no further progress. Against a background of very limited funds and of immense need and demand, looking back now, I feel we failed to meet all subsequent requests, I have to admit. These included granting substantial funds for expenses for treatment of serious illnesses like cancer, for organ transplantations, etc., and requests to meet substantial fees to help with higher professional education. And I have to acknowledge that we could not do that. And I was very happy to know that other larger organizations soon stepped in, and this includes the KMECT, KMECT, Kashmiri Pandit organization based in Bombay, KOA of USA and Canada, and indeed individuals both within India and overseas. And they played a sterling role, helpful um, beyond imagination. And finally, the helpful role played by late Sri Balasaheb Thackeray, that's all well too known to all of us. And we can never pay our debt to him. I think that's what I would like to say on the issue of humanitarian activities. But we can discuss any further
Yes,
issues
sure,
on that later on.
sure. So, very rightly put that not only as a sensitive person, but as a doctor, you identified the thing scientifically, and you mentioned the name of organizations and people how conscious they were.
Yeah,
And now the question comes. That's why education has stood us the test of the time. It has been our weapon against the jihad. In fact, our way of fighting it back. So it's because of the response and the basically support of the people like you that we have been able to take this sustenance forward or struggle forward. Now, very important thing that, as you rightly said, that Abrahamic tradition, how it deals with the other communities, the aborigines. You had been involved in interfaith activities, sensitizing the masses about the Sanatan tradition, the Dharmic tradition. What has been your you can say approach, and what has been your feedback in terms of this interfaith sensitization activities and trying to bring to the world what actually we are, because there has been a we can say I can say a kind of a subversive activity going on to present the Hindu Dharma in a bad light. But your activities, the people who are working with you, your team and your friends and like-minded people, how these sensitization activities
yeah.
of producing the Dharma in the global perspective has given you dividends. What you see has been the change in opinion. What have been the positives out of
Being based here, I think I will at this moment for a while move away from Kashmir and talk about these issues in general. And the first point is about the faith and interfaith. At the faith level, my job, as of others, was and is to raise awareness among British Hindus of their identity and their issues, that, and to ensure that the youth here get educated in their faith and culture, which is very urgent when you are living in an environment which is anything but Hindu. We've made some success thus far, but our work is ongoing. When it comes to the interfaith, I went to the interfaith in order to represent Hindus, to present the Hindu faith and culture in its true perspective, and present issues facing British Hindus, such as acts of religious hatred against Hindus, of misrepresentation, of maligning, and vilification of Hindu faith and culture. At the interfaith, the agenda tends to be dominated, not surprised, by those of the Abrahamic faith who attend in large numbers, are habitually assertive, all working in unison with each other at various levels, before and during the meetings. The representatives of Dharma-based faiths, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and Jains, we have lagged behind at how we present ourselves, how we negotiate. We need to draw together to derive support from each other, I learned, without being anyone else's opponent. For me, it was a learning curve, and since then, I have shared my experiences at different fora so that others planning to be at the interfaith can do a better job. The next comment is on religious education. Unlike in India, in Britain, it's obligatory to teach in schools about all faiths. This is unlike in India. In practice, however, in the past, the curriculum focused mostly on Abrahamic faiths. What little there was on other faiths gave a distorted picture. On Hinduism, for example, there was a little mention of the basic tenets, then a mention of social malpractices like caste-based discrimination, sati, etc. We have been guilty of in that misrepresentation. In the past, there's been a poor or even non-attendance by Hindus at the curriculum setting meetings, and of those who did attend, a laissez-faire attitude among many, this resulting in our poor contribution to the setting of the curriculum. That scenario, I'm glad to say, is now being addressed by a more awake and aware Hindu Samaj. When it comes to the international issue, shall I go on to that now?
Yes, please. Yes, please. You can
um,
basically what you said on international scene, the kind of human rights
yeah,
issues. There has been selective narrative, like Amnesty International
yeah.
saying we can intervene here, not there. And in Kashmir, we have seen what the role the
I think
organization
that's what I will
Amnesty have done.
want to comment on.
Yes.
We were caught on the back foot, defensive for a long time, unable to know how to have ourselves heard. A lot of money and effort had been spent in preparing the Pakistani narrative from well in advance of that winter of 1989-90. Even as the exodus was in progress, the Muslims here had established a Kashmir Human Rights Organization, presenting the Kashmiri Muslims as the sole victims of human rights abuses. So this had been set up as the exodus was happening. They had managed to make a member of the House of Lords its chairman to give it credibility. Some years later, this lord was persuaded to visit Pakistan occupied Kashmir and then come to Kashmir Valley to meet with the victims there. He sensed that the story he had received was not the whole, and he demanded that on his return to the UK via Delhi, he stops over in Jammu. This suggestion was not received well, but he insisted. He visited Kashmiri Hindu camps and came to know that the people there, severely distressed, were not migrants but displaced people who had been forcibly expelled. He was later to acknowledge to me that he had been misled, but the damage had been done. When we made contact with the Amnesty International, they refused to take up our case, saying their remit was limited to fighting for people victimized by the states, and they could not take up the case of Kashmiri Hindus. And that's my personal
Okay. So
observation.
what was the response in UK and Europe on this issue?
Well, same thing, non-response, because outside of these bodies, the politicians were towing a politically correct line. They are doing everything possible to restore normalcy there, full stop, and the media completely silent, only peddling a one-sided narrative. The fact that a label of migrants had been given to Kashmiri Hindus weakened for years our case. Years ago, some legal experts told me in Brussels that our people could not qualify as refugees as one has to be in another country to be regarded as a refugee. The term internally displaced people has been used only recently, but even that does not have any human rights or legal connotations. So we remain on a weak wicket there. The scene has changed since then, however. Politicians, governments, and the journalists are now more aware of this ambiguity and more aware of the plight of Kashmiri Hindus. But the politicians continue to keep a politically correct stance in their public pronouncements. I say this thing, they publicly they will remain aloof, but privately most of them know what's going on, or what has been going on. That the India-based human rights organizations has not helped the case of Kashmiri Hindus is well known to you, and I don't need to comment on that.
Yes, yes.
Despite all this, I believe that we should not accept defeat. As with the media, we should continue to lobby those in the human rights industry and call them to account. As national and international human rights organizations, what they say counts in circles, in some circles. And if they acknowledge that Hindus in Kashmir were deprived of their human rights, it would further strengthen our cause. What about the UK and Europe? When we Kashmiri Hindus were faced with the Holocaust in 1989-90, we were caught unprepared. I mentioned that. We didn't immediately know what to do on various fronts. Here, I give credit to the late Girdari Lal Sharma, originally of Jammu, based in Denmark, who very soon started organizing international conferences on Kashmir in the 1990s to present our point of view. This was initially in London and Leicester in the UK, then in Oslo, Copenhagen, Hague, and Frankfurt in Europe. He placed before the public the plight of the Hindus of Kashmir, and many of us contributed, and I was able to join all of those conferences. I have vivid memories of the various conference venues being surrounded by huge crowds, come rain, come freezing cold, holding banners proclaiming their anti-India narrative, continuously heckling, shouting vulgar anti-India abuse. The actions of these protesters were aimed at stopping the local people from knowing the actual facts of the real situation in Kashmir of an Islamic jihad that their media had not conveyed to them. Um, in one instance I will dilate upon, and it gives a few indicators of what was going on. Many years ago, I was invited to a Kashmir conference in Holland by the local Hindus. They told me that for many years, Kashmir conferences had been held there on an annual basis, but on each occasion, they would only hear the Pakistani narrative without any Hindu contribution. After persistent protests, the organizing lady had finally accepted a Hindu contribution, and so I arrived on the scene. The hostess, a young Danish woman, presented herself as representing a local human rights organization, presenting to the delegates the recent events in Kashmir from a human rights perspective. From her very introductory comments, her intentions became clear. Her star contributor, a Kashmiri Muslim, had been flown all the way over from the valley of Kashmir to give a first-hand account of what was happening there. She said he was a hero who had been tortured and shot at by Indian soldiers, and mentioned that a few days ago she had presented him with a Human Rights Award. He came in limping, holding a walking aid, and avoided looking at me or talking to me. Soon I sensed that this young man had been shot at in the leg during an encounter between the terrorists and the security forces. He was accompanied by a Hindu woman from Jammu, the daughter of the editor of a local newspaper there. I knew him, having met him in his office only a few years previously. I had gone there to protest what he had been writing in his editorials. The Kashmiri Muslim and this young woman took a long time speaking at great length of the alleged persecution, torture, and worse being suffered by Kashmiri Muslims at the hands of Indian soldiers. I had prepared a PowerPoint presentation, submitted it to her in advance, but when my turn came to make my contribution, she said, unfortunately, much of the time has been taken up already. She was running short of time, and I should give my comments in very brief time, in a minute or two. I was taken aback, but not surprised. I made a brief contribution, rapidly ran through my slides as a backdrop. This put her in severe discomfort, and I could see that um, she was not happy about this. Um, that a different narrative was coming out through my slides. When the conference ended, the star speaker and the Hindu woman rapidly went to a separate table for refreshments in the company of some local Muslims. The two avoided again interacting with me or even facing me. And that was no surprise. The local Hindus, my invitees, were very pleased that at last a narrative had been heard countering the oft-repeated anti-India narrative. I just mentioned this episode as an example of how things were happening at that time and the stone walls that we were facing. The stance changed from Kashmir as a disputed territory, a cause of three wars between neighboring countries, now armed with nuclear weapons, and that we in the West must do everything to help them resolve this issue. So that was the public stance at that time. On diplomatic front, India has succeeded in having this dispute regarded now as a bilateral issue between the two countries, not as an international issue, and it's a big advance. With Islamic terrorism taking front stage during the last 2 decades and having to deal with Islamic jihadi terrorism in their own country, territory, and beginning with the New York attacks and then London attacks and so on, the West has taken a step back on offering mediation. Despite what you may hear, they would rather not have to intervene. With terrorism coming to them, no longer in distant India, they agreed to a bilateral accord on dealing with terrorism that India and had been asking for years, and proscribed many organizations and monitored funds being laundered to support terrorism in India, or let's say terrorism overseas. And that was another step forward. My gut feeling, and this is supported by personal interaction with various people, politicians, journalists, and citizens, is that they have now an idea, albeit vague in some cases, of something having gone wrong in Kashmir, that what they had been told was not true, and they now feel uncomfortable. But for vote bank reasons, they would rather not admit this in public. And this includes particularly the members of British Parliament, unfortunately, including some of our own Hindu MPs. The latter have fought shy of openly supporting the case and the cause of the Hindus of Kashmir. There's one exception to this dismal routine, and I name him. Bob Blackman has been openly espousing the case for India. In many debates, he has stood alone in parliament and outside to confront the pro-Pakistan lobby. He is clear. The unfinished business is the return of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir to its legal owner, India.
Okay, it was again wonderful hearing on that. What exactly was the ground situation, how lobbying was done, and how cause was being dented, which was actually the human rights cause. Now, Dr. Saab, you have been not only active physically, but your interventions in terms of papers, your publications have
Oh,
been on wide.
I wouldn't want to dwell on that, but very, very briefly. Time doesn't allow me to expand on it. I'll just mention that in the main, these cover two subjects. One deals with Dharma and the issues relating to Hindu Samaj, including Hindu Samaj in Britain. The second deals with the Kashmir issue, in reality, Jammu and Kashmir issue, because it's not a Kashmir issue, it's a Jammu and Kashmir issue. In the latter case, my aim was to inform of what's been happening there in actual fact. I referred to the plight of Hindus, how they had been callously neglected and treated as political pawns in the broader game of national and international political chess. And I documented how the Hindu mandirs and shrines have been desecrated, damaged, and destroyed. And I know that paper irritated some quarters to no end. I would rather not say any more on that, but we can go
Exactly.
on any of
Fine.
these issues later on.
Now, one hour coming again to the main issue, as we know that you have beautifully said that it's not only Hindus of Kashmir, but it's a broader plan to destabilize the Hindus. And now coming to the to understand the nuances of jihad. So this jihad in Kashmir is a part of pan-Islamic whole onslaught. How do you see this jihad in Kashmir permeating the body politic, governance, and every arm?
Well,
And
I have formed an opinion, and I'll go into it at a greater length, because it's important that people don't know what to do with it and what to say about it. That an Islamic jihad, well planned and executed, devastated and uprooted the Hindus of Kashmir, does not need discussion. It's out in the open now. But we hear of similar stories in other places frequently now. The ISIL, the Yazidis, the atrocities in African countries, attacks in Europe, in Southeast Asia, etc., etc. We hear on the international media all the time. When an attack happens and 46 people are killed, when a bomb explodes and 180 people are killed, they cannot but mention it. So the world is now sick and tired of jihad and needs a way out of it. Lessons have been learned, but where do we go from here? We need to understand what jihad is really all about. Muslims are told by the jihadis that the jihad is for their protection, a fight against those who are persecuting them, and they have to do that to protect Islam, which is in danger. That is the story sold to the ordinary innocent Muslim. But that argument is now beginning to run thin. I want to clarify 2 points here before I move forward. First is that while we know that all Muslims are not fanatical and jihadists, Islamic fanaticism and jihad, that's a fact of life now. You can't say it doesn't exist. It adversely affects people the world over. A spade must be called a spade. Don't run away from it. Unfortunately, the non-fanatical Muslims are scared to go public for fear they would be got at. My Muslim friends admit that, but in confidence. Up until now, they wouldn't engage in a free public debate. Those who are fanatical and jihadis, opposed to a multi-religious coexistential way of life, need to be identified and marginalized. This is an intellectual issue that demands honesty in public discourse. That honesty has been denied here so far, with Muslims vehemently forbidding any honest and public discussion about Islam, throwing the genie of Islamophobia in your face. That position must be reversed. Winds are changing. A minority is beginning to speak up, and such discussion is to be promoted. There is a risk of these being labeled as Islamophobic, and they are being given death threats. The purpose is to kill such fora of discussion. I'm sure that right-thinking Muslims will recognize that a constructive debate is in their longer-term interests. They need to be coming to terms with a changed world. They redefined how they coexist with people of other faiths as they live in countries where they are in a minority. It'll surely happen, I know. The question is how long it takes, and that I do not know, but it will happen. What about the Indian
Now,
government?
I would like to ask one thing.
Yeah,
Basically, I'm coming to that only. Basically, in the post-independent India, it was not the partition which happened in 1990, but the Kashmiri Pandit genocide or religious cleansing took place in post-independent India.
yeah.
How do you see the response of Indian government to the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits and the denial? This denial mode has led to its duplication, replication in other parts. And how do you see the response of continuous government still present towards the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus?
Uh, you have to go back to that awful winter of 1989-90 and remember at that time, the administration and the governance had been decimated for a period of time in Kashmir. And the government at the center didn't know what to do and how to handle it. And they lost the plot. Then they started picking up the pieces, but it took time. And so I think inept politicians, complicit media, and ignorant people were party to this. Ignorant as well as unconcerned, because if you are aware and awake, you become concerned, and that is not enough, then you have to be activists. That didn't happen. But what's happening, we've gone a stage beyond that. There are similar scenes taking place in Bengal, Assam, Kerala, etc. And people are beginning to realize that Kashmir was only the beginning. And I am not concerned about the government of India. My concern is the people. Once the people are awake and aware, and they take to activism, and they insist on an open public dialogue, that to me is more important than a government sending in security forces to deal with forceful activism. Of course, terrorists have to be dealt with individually, but I'm talking of forceful activism dealing with populations. You can't do that thing with a harsh force. You have to have constructive dialogue, debate. Yeah.
Yes. So this is one thing. Now we're coming to the next segment that actually I want to ask you. This whole period of exodus or forced exile, whatever we call it, how you see we have sustained this onslaught and the sustenance? How to sustain? Because we don't know when this period of desperation will end. What is your understanding through your experience of saying these things? How we have sustained and how we will sustain during this exile?
I'll, may I come to that after another um,
Yes, please.
comment?
Yes.
And could I request 1 minute of break, please?
Yes, of course, sure. You
All
can
right.
take it, sir. Please.
I'm sorry. Okay. Right.
Yes.
Okay. Um, just going back to where I was, I mentioned because this has to do with the way forward.
Hmm.
I referred to, and it's very easy for me to criticize, but this is reflections I'm offering. I referred to inept politicians, malfunctioning governance, and I referred to the complicity of the media. I also mentioned the most important, which is the public, the general public, the citizens of the country who are unawake, unaware, non-active, and that is the fundamental problem. And could I just take you back to two episodes? One is the Parmeshwari incident
Hmm.
in Kashmir Valley, and the more recent Amarnath
Land route.
protests in
Yes.
Jammu,
Yes. Yes.
how that public activism was massacred by politicians. And so each time that happens, our cause takes a step back, and we need to make sure these things aren't repeated. So I just, before we go to the final point, I just want to comment on the question of Indian government vis-a-vis the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus.
Hmm.
The present government now has inherited an issue of our exodus that's been around for over 3 decades, inherited a political case that's been mismanaged for over 7 decades. And in the context of an unpleasant religio-historical mayhem with Kashmiri Hindus as victims of religious fanaticism, a mayhem that has prevailed over 7 centuries. And we want it to be resolved overnight. It cannot be. We know that, and I think we know, some of us certainly know that, and we are patient. We need to be patient. But at the same time, we want to see the government of India resolve it with a firm hand, and there needs to be a long-term strategy. Some changes have come about, but more needs to be done. The government needs to term the tortures, the rapes, and the mass killings of the Hindu minority in Kashmir, culminating in their exodus, as genocide. What, when that is done, the governments around the world will take greater note, official note. It will rectify a historical record. It will also have a significant legal implication with longer term results that would help redress the wrongs that have been done to us. Second, the Hindus' properties and their sacred shrines and mandirs should be given full protection those damaged or destroyed, and it's happening as we speak, it should be rebuilt and the protection maintained. The houses and lands left behind by Hindus should be restored to their owners, and the proper compensation given for houses that have been destroyed and lands appropriated. Fourthly, the individuals who tortured and killed Hindus, some of them have publicly boasted about having killed Hindus, should be brought to justice and soon. And finally, to repeat myself, the fanatics and jihadis should be marginalized. That's the longer term solution. And the hands of those who are not part of the fanaticism and jihad should be strengthened. There are many ways, peaceful and constructive, I emphasize, of doing that. Um, we now come to possibly.
Yes, I am now coming to the very important thing, that is about our sustenance. We have been sustaining, we have been struggling, as you rightly said, this is a wrong drawn battle till we our human rights are upheld. But what is your opinion, your perspective in terms of your experience? We have been sustaining. What should be our next stage to basically reinforce our sustenance and keep this narrative of sensitizing the people? The sensitization should not end at all. But how should we sustain in this long period in the coming
Indeed.
years also?
Indeed. I have heard many eminent speakers giving their views. I have heard them express their frustration, annoyance that things are not happening that should have happened, and so on and so forth. I understand all that thing. So I'm going to make this my final contribution, after which then we could have an open conversation, because I think this is also important in terms of it deals with our tomorrow. We remember those who lost their lives, we empathize with their families and empathize with those who lost their homes, belongings, and their roots. The latter can be and must be addressed, but in the meantime, we have to continue to live as best as we can. We have proved resilient despite suffering ignominy and all sorts of handicaps. As a community, we have survived. That resilience we have demonstrated comes from our past experiences, in my view, from our ancestors having suffered 7 exoduses in as many centuries. Let me now refer to a few concerns that are engaging our minds, that is, concerns about our unity, our culture, and our language. The Holocaust and Exodus should have knitted us together into a united community. On the surface, it appears it hasn't. We failed to put up a truly united political front. We could have made more progress than we did. And I refer you once more to the Parmeshwari case. But we shouldn't feel negative. This is a little bit of a problem, but it shouldn't disengage us. We are educated and we are entitled to our opinions, and that's not a bad thing. And it's not unique to us. Jews will tell you that within their community, there are as many opinions as the number of Jews. They laugh about saying that, and they mean it because it's true, and I have seen that happen. But look at their achievements. So therefore, having different opinions, arguing is not a bad thing. But acting to incapacitate one another is a different story. And that is something that you have to give your thoughts to. Having said this, we need to strengthen our identity and one that's based on our historical valley-based culture, which must not be thrown out, as well as a broader one of being part of the Indian, indeed of the world Hindu Samaj. We should remember we are not alone. Yes? If I acknowledge somebody else as a fellow Hindu, then he is going to acknowledge me as his brother or sister. That's most important. Remember that we were, with little hiccups, we were given a first place of sustenance in Jammu. We must never forget that. The Holocaust and Exodus, as I said, should have brought us unity as never before. Uh, I think, repeating myself, it has done to a large extent, barring a few instances. Please, let's all work on that, continue to work on that unity. I honestly believe it's not an unsurmountable task. Don't get frustrated or disappointed by the odd mavericks. There are individuals with vested interests, some in India and a few based in the United States, in their academic podia, pontificating on us, working against our own interests. We have to counter their narratives and we have to marginalize them. That should not be difficult. It may take time, it should not be difficult because truth is on our side. Coexisting with those who hold opposite views takes courage and forbearance. But truth, logic, and reasoning ultimately will prevail. So shrug your shoulders, bear with whatever they may be throwing at us, and keep on your path of action. What's at stake is our culture and identity, and that is the most difficult job for us. It's a primary issue for me, and it's up to us to take care of that. Protecting and promoting our language, maintaining our customs, our festivals, religious and social, and not letting our children forget who they are. We have to accept that our culture will no longer be as it was when we left the valley. And I need us to remember this. We cannot live in a freeze frame. Change is inevitable. Our culture and language are not exactly as they were in the time of Abhinav Gupta or in the time of Laleshwari. Cultures change constantly over time. Language also does, albeit somewhat more slowly. History tells us that, and it happens everywhere. That change is unstoppable. In being a part of that change, we introspect, we debate, and at the same time, we cleanse ourselves of any social malpractices that may be here with us, and that we should take as an opportunity. There is a positive future to look forward to. The possibility of reviving Sharada language and script and of purifying the kosher of foreign words that have been interpolated into it over the years. When I hear anybody speak a Kashmiri now, I see it as a semi-foreign language, not the one that I used to speak in my childhood. And who knows, our future generations may be able to visit and worship at Narayan Nag and at the Sharda Tirthan in Neelam Valley. So some things to look forward to. But above all, we must stay on the path of Sanatan Dharma. Our ancestors did that at the cost of their lives. They gave their lives to protect it. And they did not give up their faith and their way of life. And we must not fail them. We must not forget we have a patronage towards them. And I repeat once more, we must stay on the path of Dharma at all costs. We may regulate the rate at which our culture evolves, and more importantly, influence the direction of that change. Prepared that the culture is going to be modified as it is being modified in different places wherever we are. But acknowledge that we cannot live in the past. The evolution of our culture cannot be halted. That should not be seen as a problem. Crucial to that resolve is for us to educate our youth and future generations about our ancient faith and our customs. We should be prepared to answer their questions in a multi-religious, multicultural environment. They are likely to be bombarded with distorted accounts of our faith and culture and find that they are not sure of their identity any longer. When that happens, they'll come and ask answers from parents and from elders. That's where our job is, to explain rationally, to explain why our faith and culture are good, that it has been good enough to have survived many onslaughts over the millennia. It's one of the most ancient civilizations in the world. When we know about our faith and are firmly rooted in our culture and identity, our children will not move away from it. That I'm sure of. If they get ambiguous answers from parents and elders, if they see them as poor role models, they're not going to be Kashmiri Hindus for a long time, in a long time. In conclusion, I'm an optimist overall. We have survived the Holocaust. I'm aware of the concerns within the community of this threat to our identity, culture, and language. But I'm also aware of many who are now actively working to protect our identity and promoting our language. And may I, at this moment, pay tribute to Sunilji here, to Sushilji, to Roots in Kashmir, to Kashmir as it is, and to all others who have taken up this challenge, and convey my very good wishes to them. And to you, Maheshji, for having been a gracious host, for having listened to my thoughts so patiently. But I'm here now to hear
It
your
was
comments.
it was wonderful listening to you. It was just going down the memory lane also, and then it was like a Sri Aurobindo's ascent and descent of the integral yoga for me, because I was having the death immersion and then coming out, trying to live out those times as myself as a small child and now growing into an adult. That much we have internalized, and how much you people, our elders, have invested, so that we are able to come up to your expectations, because you had the meager resources, everything was hostile, and beyond that you people try to create an ecosystem. We are able to keep this, you can say, aesthetics and place consciousness of homeland alive in us. Now you have touched everything. It was not a pessimistic discourse on narrative on your part. It was all a kind of a very positive and a very optimistic kind of a message you gave. But I have certain questions which are very simple, layman questions. So you have seen that there has been denial of genocide, and for me, denial of genocide is double genocide. First, you are not accepting it, then you are just denying it. And second thing is that the taking advantage of this desperation, the policies have been framed in such a way by the Indian political class across the sections that to combine return and rehabilitation with employment, and this has given our youth a kind of a desperation. How do you see, do you think this kind of policy is trivialization of genocide? Because when whole place conscious, your mohallas, your homes are not there, you have to create a new infrastructure. Even after the 370 abrogation, there is a difference between de facto and de jure Islamic state. But how do you see should be the policy premise of the policymakers to not to trivialize this thing, because we are not the victims of earthquake, natural calamities like you can say famine and other things. It is a man-made disaster that has been inflicted on us by the fanatics of Islam. So how do you think should be the policies of government uh, tuned to address this thing?
Um, I have very a different take on this. Um, the denial of genocide that we talk about and which is real is not unique to us. There are genocides that have happened elsewhere that have been forgotten. In Cambodia, several million people were massacred. In Rwanda, same thing happened. Turks committed genocide against the Armenians, and the Armenians keep saying a genocide happened to us, and this is repeatedly denied. There is a simple thing, a word of apology, that goes a long way towards um, bringing people back towards each other. Look what happened in South Africa between blacks and whites. But that's not the case. Up till now, people have not recognize that it has to happen. It's not that I want people to be hurt and because they hurt me, no. But how can we be friends if we live in our own worlds and deny what happened? Let me give you another example. Crusades happened. If you read the historical accounts, and there are multiple sources for that, they committed atrocities, both sides. So what's happened now? The Pope was persuaded to come and issue a public apology about Christians having committed atrocities against the Muslims of that time. When the Muslims have been asked to do the same, they have pointedly refused, point blank. They said, we did not do anything. So when you ignore history, for example, we talk about our colonial past, but the colonial past wasn't the British alone. It was that 1,000 years ago, people came as invaders from outside, looting and destroying and causing a mayhem. That was a genocide, the biggest genocide overall, the biggest genocide in history. And nobody talks about that. If you talk to any people, academics and scholars, they will say, oh, they are not colonials. They settled here and therefore they are our people. No, you can't run away from history. I would say genocide is an awful thing to have happened, but it hurts doubly when people saying, no, that wasn't a genocide. And to hurt it trebly that you left your homes of your own accord. And how awful can it be? And we must not give up until there is an acknowledgement of what happened. So on one side, we have come to terms with our past, what happened to us, we have survived, we are living and making the best for ourselves individually and as a community, and that's how it should be. But what happened, what was done to us cannot be forgotten. And the same Bob Blackman I mentioned earlier on said at one of the meetings that just as the Jewish suffered a Holocaust and they now have their Memorial Day, they also have a Holocaust memorial place. And why aren't you doing that? Why shouldn't you establish a Holocaust memorial so that people in the coming generations will come to know what happened to Kashmiri Hindus? So I think, the genocide that happened is a thing of the past, but the connotations that are there today and what tomorrow, that is for us to deal with. No question of that. What was your second point?
It was about to link this return and rehabilitation with the employment and terming it as the return of the Hindus of Kashmir. Do you think this is trivialization of genocide?
It isn't, but I think when the whole narrative isn't given to you, then it sounds as if it's a trivialization. The issue of genocide is not simply political. It affects our entire community, and indirectly it affects the entire Hindu community, and indeed indirectly it affects the entire Indian community, including the Muslims and Jews and Parsis and so on. They came escaping their persecution as refugees to India, the Syrian Christians and the Jews and the Parsi Zoroastrians. They would understand it. So it's a global issue, and it is not for only the government to deal with. I think if we raise this as a point of discussion and debate within the mainstream media, it would move forward. We mustn't constantly think as if it is a Kashmiri Hindu versus the government of India. We mustn't do that. The government of India has issues of law and order, governance of legislation, all sorts of things to deal with at the same time, and as well as to deal with this issue. So we mustn't see it only as a government of India issue. Let's engage the public and the media and the academia and the political observers all, so that ultimately it becomes a public debate. And I think that would be an advance in which we have to play a primary role. In terms of the return of pundits and employment, we've been constantly saying until the terrorism is eliminated and until there is a secure environment, it would be foolhardy for anybody to go there. Individuals have gone for the purpose of employment and stayed in very secured places. That's not living. And so we have to go, we will go. There are some people who will say, oh, well, our children are now established and settled and doing their jobs and they are not going to go to Kashmir. That's not the case. That's, putting it wrongly. Some will not go, but there are already there a few thousand, and then many tens of thousands will go back. And that is our root. That's where we were born. That's why I want to be, like to be at the end, if nothing, not in body, in my ashes. And so it's my Matrabhumi. I cannot give it up. And I will not give it up, and my children will not give it up. So a narrative that says that, oh, it's gone, that is not to be promoted. That is not to be promoted. Because the other thing I mentioned earlier on, you give up on Kashmir, it is Bengal's turn, then it's Assam's turn, then it's Kerala's turn, and you keep on doing that thing. You don't run away from problems. We have to face them. The very first chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Yes, it's your duty to face a difficult problem. And that was Krishna saying to Arjun. And we mustn't forget that. It's our job. And we have to support the government in whatever they are doing, but at the same time, tell them that what their, as you said, what their approach should be, to take up the whole issue globally and deal with all strands of it. Just building, let's say, an establishment of flats in Jagati is good. It rehabilitated a number of families. It doesn't solve Kashmir issue. If, as I read yesterday or day before, that they are setting up some similar flats in Vesu, which is near Anantnag, that, okay, maybe, but it's a small step in that direction, but not the whole. So I would say that the government has to, I mentioned that earlier on, have a longer term strategy. And the sad thing is that they have never taken us as stakeholders in that planning. And I think some of my colleagues have said that in public. But it's for us to establish a united front. And if we went as true representatives of the community in a united way, then they are likely to take us more seriously and do business, rather than I go there today and say something, somebody else comes tomorrow and say, oh, no, he's not a leader. I am the one. So let's introspect on the issue, on that issue.
As you rightly said, yes. So now, in your opinion, there have been talks about the different settlements at different places, as you identified. No? So what actually you visualize, people in the community are majoritarily saying in one voice or the other that we want one permanent settlement at one place with complete control over our own destiny, with free flow of Indian constitution. How you respond to it at one place settlement or whatever you call it?
That was based on a gut reaction of people immediately post-Exodus, the concept of Permanent Kashmir, because having been mercilessly treated and tortured and killed, they couldn't imagine at that time of going back and living in villages surrounded by other people who may turn out to be good people, or you would never know who is a terrorist. And therefore, they felt the only place that they would have secure is an identified place called Kashmir. But then that would be the scenario of a two nation theory coming back to haunt us based on religion. Pakistan wanted a two nations created on the basis of religion, and we said we are secular. And what is then to stop people in other places wanting similar things? And this is not anything new, but in early times in Kerala, they established a Muslim majority area within the state. And that is not something that you really want to promote if we want to continue with our so-called secular state, or let us say multi-religious state, in which people of different faiths live in harmony with each other, which should be our goal. If you don't do that thing, then you have to deal with the alternative of what do you do if people live in segregated areas. So I never uh, had an answer to that. I think a time comes, everything peaks. A time comes, and the Kashmiri Muslims, I know, are as fed up of terrorism as we are. We suffered horrifically, but they have also been affected indirectly and in many ways. And many of them, who, as I referred earlier, are not of jihadi mentality, would cooperate with the government's initiatives over a period of time. When it's gone off the boil and the terrorism has been eliminated, then in stages we would return home. In stages we would return home. What those stages would be something that you on the ground there would decide. You would contribute to the decision making, and I think decide that if we say no, it can't be done, then we have already given up. But it's something that can be done and will happen. The
So,
question of employment is a minor one, is a minor one. It'll come when families have settled there and their children then need to have education, access to education, and youngsters will need to go to get employment. Those are things that governments of the day will have to provide. But at this time, the first point is security, and to be living in an environment of hostility and terrorism. Those things have to be eliminated first.
so this is your take on it. Now, on the parting note, I would like to ask you that now the youth, you are saying that social media and everything has connected everyone. How do you see the response of Kashmiri Pandit youth to this whole Holocaust and this sustenance challenge? Do you think they are coming up to the mark as per the expectations of the elders, how they have done? How do you see their performance worldwide now?
I must confess that I'm not very good with social media, but from what I have interacted with the youngsters, they have till now have had a less than active role. They have behaved as observers, and it is up to us to encourage them to become active partners. I think this is more particularly relevant within, let's say, Jammu and in Delhi, those who are nearer to our valley. And I think they need to be engaged in that dialogue. Um, and I think they have a very relevant voice, very valuable voice, which should be taken into account, and they should be seen and then made seen as a made stakeholders. If that has happened, that's fine. I know there are already a few who come to the webinars, who come give talks on which are recorded on YouTube and so on and so forth, and I'm proud of them. I hope there are many more like that, because it For people like me, it's historical, but for them, it's their future. So I would want to promote them as much as possible. And those of you who are in the social media, please bring them in, pull them in, and ask them to contribute. And the only point I want to make is that because there is total freedom within the social media, everybody should take care to be polite and to be constructive. And it should not be, this is what I feel and I don't care about anybody else. So we have to coexist. And therefore, let us encourage a constructive discussion, interaction on the social media. And this second point on this social media is that through there, you would more easily reach out to the youngsters. In the olden days, we would have had a meeting somewhere, an open meeting somewhere, or a conference somewhere. A number of people would come, and only those people would hear what you want to say. And then you wouldn't be able to hear everybody's view. But within the social media, that scenario has changed. You can, as people say, at the flick of a button, reach out to a number of people. And at the same time, all of them have that ability to express their opinion. And the youngsters appreciate that. So it's not an elderly person like me giving a talk and then they have to listen to whether they like it or not. And then as soon as it is finished, they go home to do their usual things. That this is a very, very valuable thing that can be done only by the social media. But I think we were watching last night Sadhguru's YouTube, and he was talking about how social media is also being misused for other purposes. And here there is a continuing debate about the social media being misused where they abuse freedom of expression by putting in hateful and other things, inciting violence and so on. And those things should never be allowed. But within our community social media groups, I know that won't happen. Somebody may express frustration. We are a unique community which, while subjected to the Holocaust, never took to gun, never took to violence. We are the ones who keep asking, what had we done to be subjected to this? And there is no answer. The only answer is we happen to be Hindus. And that's all, who did not want to join a so-called insurgency. And therefore, by nature, we are non-violent, peaceful. And I don't think there is any risk of, inviting youngsters to these social media interactions and giving them a free wind to express themselves. And through that, hopefully, over a period of time, achieving a consensus. That would happen. That way we would, engage them all. I can't see any other. Remember this thing that we're now spread all over into different corners of India and a few elsewhere, like in Europe and America, etc. And no matter wherever you are, through the social media, you are communicating with each other. So that needs to be done.
That is really a very, very, I can say, visionary kind of an advice or suggestion, whatever, however we take it. So it was very nice and to talk with you. And in fact, it was just listening to you was really a kind of blessing, a freewheeling conversation from start. And we came to know many things, what you did on the ground zero, how the situation was like, what is the state of the state, and how things are crystallizing now. I hope this whole discussion will be watched very carefully by the people. You said the stakeholders, actually. We have never been taken as stakeholders in this process. Once this is acknowledged, this genocide is acknowledged, it will lead to many way outs and it will open new vistas. And till then, we have to keep on struggling. We are doing it steadfastly. It was a wonderful talking to you, Dr. Saab. And
I think it was actually my privilege that I had this opportunity to talk to you. I want to conclude with 3 points. The first one is we had a frog in well syndrome back in the valley, particularly before Banihal Tunnel came. We didn't know what was outside. People, if anybody went overseas, they used to do shraddh for that person. So we had a very insular mindset, and that has changed and is changing once more. What has happened with us, we have partially come to terms with it. We must look forward while demanding justice and redress. And third thing I did say about our concern, culture and language and identity. So long as there are young activists out there in the field, and I've seen many of them, I named a few, one or two, I am an optimist. I think it's for all of us to protect that. And thank you for having me.
So nice of you. And it was again your words of wisdom at the last, and very true. Kashmiri Pandits are a living tradition. It's a continuity. We have been progressive. We are progressing in spite of continued genocides and persecution. We have shown that we are not only peace loving, we have the national interest at the core of our heart. We are the upholders of the Sanskrit civilization of India. And that's what we are doing. We are basically reversing this trend of the de-Sanskritization, of which we are the anchors and seeds. My namaskar to you. So nice of you for taking your valuable time for us. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and namaskar to you and to
Thank you so much.
Shishirji. Namaskar.